The Ocoee Riot was a violent incident that occurred on November 2, 1920 in Ocoee, Florida. It began with a dispute over voting rights and escalated into a deadly confrontation between black residents who were trying to exercise their right to vote and white residents who were trying to stop them. I'll tell you more coming up. This is KRT, Critical Race Theory. It's not the one they teach in law schools, but the one banned in public schools. In the decades and days leading up to the November 2, 1920 election, several factors were in play that allowed an event like the Ocoee Massacre to occur. The build-up to the riot had been building for a long time. One of those factors, and the most obvious one, was enslavement. Florida had been a safe place for slaves due to it being a Spanish safe haven. Back in 1687, the first set of slaves were welcomed by the Spanish colony of La Florida. There were 8 men, 3 women, and a 3-year-old child. Even more followed seeking refuge in Florida. But the rules changed after the Adams-Onis Treaty when Spain ceded the territory to the U.S. By 1845, Florida was admitted into the Union, and even though the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery in the country, it gave rise to the Jim Crow laws. In Florida, that impacted intermarriage, cohabitation, education, and juvenile delinquents involving white and black individuals. The Jim Crow laws dominated for years, even during the Red Summer, when lynching and race riots increased over the course of several months in 1919. That year, a convicted molester in Jacksonville was moved to a St. Augustine jail for safety, but a white mob overran the Jacksonville jail and ended up breaking out 2 black men who were there on different charges. Both were strung up, shot, tied behind cars, and dragged around town. I'm not making this up. This is what really happened. During the 1920 election year, there was a big drive for black voter registration in Florida since they historically voted Republican. At the time, that's what the platform was. In Orlando, Judge John M. Chaney, a white Republican who was running for Senate at the time, received a letter from the Ku Klux Klan threatening him to stop giving lectures about voting in the black community. At the time, Florida was one of 4 states that relied on the poll tax to impede black voting. It was one of the first in the nation to adopt it. Before Election Day, the KKK held marches throughout the state. These events between 1850 and 1920 led up to the boiling point that spilled over into Ocoee on Election Day when a black man attempted to vote. 2 of the main individuals whose names were associated with the Ocoee Massacre are Moses Norman and July Perry. Both were black landowners and labor brokers. Essentially, they served as a go-between for black laborers and white employers. Norman had moved to the area from South Carolina and was living on the property of Civil War veteran Captain Bluford Sims while working for him, which was not uncommon for any worker, black or white. The events that immediately followed Norman's attempt to vote on November 2nd, 1920, are essentially foggy. There were different accounts, mainly because there was a deliberate attempt to not only avoid documenting evidence that occurred that night, but to destroy it. According to the Orange County Regional History Center, most historical accounts agree it started with Norman trying to vote, but was turned away for allegedly not paying his poll taxes. Later that night, after the polls closed, a group of armed white men arrived at Perry's home in search of Norman. It's unclear how the encounter escalated, but a shooting broke out. 2 white men who were law enforcement officers died, and Perry was badly injured. Perry's wife and daughter escaped from the back of the house. Perry received some level of medical attention and was taken to the Orange County Jail in downtown Orlando. According to the state of Florida's coroner's request, that took place between November 3rd and 4th, a white mob overpowered the single jailer who was left to guard Perry. The mob took Perry, beat him, shot him, and hung him from a tree. Perry's body was eventually moved to the Greenwood Cemetery, where he was buried. That night, the mob started setting black-owned homes on fire, as well as churches and a fraternal lodge. Some accounts say up to 60 blacks were murdered, but the Orange County Regional History Center recently confirmed 4 deaths through public records. A memo from the Carrie Hand Funeral Home, which was in charge of handling the bodies, read, quote, 3 colors, persons buried, caskets in one grave together. As for Norman, he fled from Ocoee and lived in other parts of Florida before leaving for New York City to live out his days. There were parts of the black community that remained untouched, but a portion was burned to the ground. In the following days, a group of white ex-servicemen surrounded Ocoee to restore order. Perry's wife, Estella, and daughter, Caritha, who had a bullet wound in her arm, were taken to the Hillsbury County Jail in Tampa, supposedly for their own safety. That really worked out for Perry, didn't it? There are historical accounts that say people showed up at the jail to gain access to them, but were turned away. After Perry's death, neither Estella nor Caritha were appointed the executor of the estate. Instead, it was passed on to Bluford Sims, one of the early settlers who served in the Confederate Army. It's unclear how he obtained the property, but he did place an advertisement in the Orlando Sentinel stating that he was selling the property that belonged to Negroes that just left Ocoee. His ad wasn't the only one selling off black properties. Within 2 weeks of the massacre, there were advertisements in Orlando and Miami offering the sale of groves and land. Well, eventually Sims was deemed incompetent, likely due to old age, and could no longer handle the state affairs. It was then passed on to his daughter-in-law, Eva Sims. Perry's family filed a lawsuit seeking compensation, and the court ordered her to provide property accounting, but she never did. To this day, although there are some deed records, it's unknown whether, if any, blacks were compensated for their property. Within 2 days of the massacre, a coroner's request into Perry's death, as well as the 2 white men who died in the initial encounter, found that their deaths were committed by unknown parties. Between November 18th through the 29th, the Department of Justice launched an investigation, but only to determine whether there was any election fraud. Well, that's got to be the least of the problems. Nothing to see here. Move along. On November 30th, a grand jury reported their findings, but to this day, the full report remains missing. Perry's wife and daughter did not face charges related to the deaths of the 2 white men searching for Norman. They were released from the jail 27 days after Election Day. After that, the family spent 12 years fighting land disputes and lawsuits over their property. On March 7, 1932, 7 relatives each received $125.90 for the loss of their home, possessions, about 30 acres of land, and their loved one, July Perry. Eventually, all residents left the area as they faced ongoing terror. In one case, George Betsy, an African-American living in Ocoee, was found injured, tied to a light post because he talked too much about the trouble at Ocoee. In other cases, dynamite was thrown into homes while other blacks were beaten and threatened. It would be at least another 50 years before an African-American moved to Ocoee. Perry's great-grandchildren live in Tampa and have since launched the July Perry Foundation. It's aimed at supporting underserved whom have a desire to become entrepreneurs, landowners, land developers, architects, and all interested in the process of agriculture, multi-unit housing, and commercial building development. In 2018, the city of Ocoee issued a proclamation during a commission meeting in remembrance of the tragic event. It reads, quote, "In 1920, the historical record shows that African American residents of West Orange County in and around what later became the city of Ocoee were grievously denied their right to vote, their civil rights, their properties, and their very lives in a series of unlawful acts perpetrated by a white mob and government officials." Last year, a historical marker was placed outside the Orange County Regional History Center located in downtown Orlando, which honors July Perry. It's the first physical memorial to acknowledge his lynching. Over the summer, Governor Ron DeSantis signed House Bill 1213 into law, creating a task force that would recommend the most accurate and appropriate ways to teach the Ocoee Massacre in classrooms. An earlier version of the bill included over $2 million in compensation for Ocoee victims and their descendants, but that language was replaced with the education curriculum out of concern that the reparations portion wouldn't pass. This has been Critical Race Theory. Thanks for checking in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and share this video with your friends and family. I'll see you next time.